A woman steps into a crowded saloon, places her baby into the hands of the most feared man in 3 territories, and walks away without looking back. The room goes quiet before anyone realizes it. A chair stops mid-scrape. Cards stay face down on the table. Garrett Hale doesn't move at first, the weight in his arms small but certain, nothing like the things he's used to carrying. Across the room, the woman is already seated, writing like time is closing in on her. Outside, boots gather on the porch, voices low, watching through the window like something's about to break. Garrett shifts his stance not toward the door, but toward her, and for a second, it's not clear who's taking the greater risk. Would you trust a stranger like that? Or wonder why she did? Stay with me. The wind came down off the hills like it had somewhere to be, pushing dust along the main road of Stone Creek Basin and rattling the loose sign above the general store. It was late afternoon in the spring of 1886, and the town moved the way it always did, slow, careful, watching. Then a horse stepped into view, not fast, not loud, just steady. The man riding it sat tall in the saddle, shoulders broad enough to block the sun for a moment as he passed the dry goods window. His coat was worn, not dirty, and the brim of his hat cast a shadow that hid his eyes. Folks on the boardwalk didn't speak, but they noticed. They always noticed. Garrett Hale had that kind of effect. Someone at the hitching rail stopped mid-sentence. Another man, halfway through lighting a cigarette, forgot to strike the match. A woman gathering laundry from a line by the side yard held a sheet in both hands and didn't move until Garrett had passed. Word traveled quicker than wagons in places like this. They said he'd worked for sheriffs who didn't put their names on paper. Said he could follow a trail through rock. Said men who tried him didn't get a second chance to try again. Garrett didn't look left or right. He rode straight down the middle of the road, dust lifting around his horse's legs, until he reached the Iron Spur Saloon. He tied the reins with a loose knot, the kind that came undone quick if needed, and stepped up onto the porch. The boards creaked under his weight. For a moment he stood there, one hand resting near his belt. Not on the gun, just close enough. Then he pushed the door open. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the low hum of conversation that dropped a notch the second he walked in. A piano played in the corner, slightly off-tempo, the player's fingers moving without his eyes ever lifting from the keys. Garrett moved to the bar. "Whiskey," he said. The bartender, a heavy man with sleeves rolled up past his elbows, poured it without a word. The glass touched the counter with a soft click. Garrett didn't drink it. He turned, leaning his back lightly against the bar, and looked out over the room, not searching wildly, just taking it in. Faces, hands, who sat with who didn't sit at all. He was looking for one man. Silas Crowder, a name that had come up too many times along dry creek beds and empty corrals, water disputes, fence lines moved in the night, small families packing up and leaving before sunrise. Garrett had been following that trail for weeks. He stood there long enough for the room to start breathing again, quietly, carefully. Then the side door opened. It wasn't loud, just a shift of hinges and a slice of sunlight cutting across the floor. A woman stepped in, carrying a bundle close to her chest. She paused just inside, letting her eyes adjust, or maybe letting the room adjust to her. Auburn dust clung to the hem of her skirt. Her dress was plain but clean, sleeves rolled just enough to show she worked with her hands. A few strands of dark hair had slipped loose around her face, catching the light. In her arms, a small child stirred, not crying, just moving. She walked to the bar. "I'm looking for work," she said. Her voice was steady, not loud, but it carried. "Sewing, leather repairs, tack mostly." The bartender didn't meet her eyes. "Ain't hiring," he said, already reaching for a rag to wipe a spot that didn't need wiping. She nodded once. No argument. No second question. "Thank you," she said. It was the kind of thank you that didn't ask for anything back. She turned to leave. Then she stopped. Not slowly. Not like she was reconsidering. Just stopped. She turned her head and looked directly at Garrett. He hadn't moved. Still leaning against the bar, glass untouched beside him. For a second, neither of them said anything. Then she stepped closer. "I need a minute," she said. "Just one." Garrett didn't answer right away. Her eyes didn't waver. "I need to write something," she added. "And I can't do that and hold her at the same time." She shifted the bundle slightly, and the blanket slipped just enough to show a small face. Dark eyes, wide and quiet. "Hold her," the woman said. Not a question. Garrett looked down at the child, then back at the woman. The room had gone still again, not like before. Different this time. Watching. Garrett Hale, who had stood across from men with guns drawn and never blinked, felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not fear. Not quite. Something else. He pushed himself off the bar. "Just a minute," he said. She stepped forward and placed the baby in his arms like it was the simplest thing in the world. Like she'd already decided he wouldn't drop her. He adjusted his grip instinctively, slower than he'd ever moved his hands before. The weight was small, warmer than he expected. The child made a soft sound and curled one hand around his finger. Garrett didn't breathe for a second. The woman turned away, pulling a folded paper and pencil from her bag. She sat at a nearby table and began to write, her hand moving quickly, like time mattered. Garrett stood there in the middle of the iron spur, a man built for hard ground and harder choices, holding something that didn't belong to any of that. The baby blinked up at him. The piano kept playing, a little steadier now. No one spoke. Garrett looked down at the small hand wrapped around his finger, and something, quiet, almost invisible, shifted. The baby didn't cry. She just held on. Across the room, the woman, Lydia he would learn, kept writing. Her hand moved quick but steady, like she'd done this before. Like asking strangers for small things wasn't new, and trusting them wasn't careless. Garrett stood there longer than a minute. He didn't count. When she finished, she folded the paper, pressed it flat with her palm, and stood. She walked back toward him without hurry, the same way she had walked in. When she reached him, she paused just long enough to look at the way he held the child. "You didn't drop her," she said. "No," Garrett answered. She took the baby back with a practiced motion. The small hand let go of his finger without complaint, like it had only borrowed it. "Her name is Eliza," Lydia said. Garrett nodded once. "Garrett." "I know," she said, not unkindly. Then she turned and left through the same side door, sunlight catching the edge of her shoulder as it closed behind her. The room found its voice again. Someone laughed too loud. A chair scraped. The piano stumbled, then recovered. Garrett picked up the whiskey. He didn't drink it. He set it back down and walked out. Outside, the light had shifted. The dust had settled some, the wind quieter now. His horse stood where he left it, head low, reins loose. Garrett untied the knot, but didn't mount. He stood there a moment, looking down the street, past the general store, past the blacksmith's open door, where iron rang against iron, toward the far end where the road bent out of town and into the hills. He knew where to go next. He had a name, a direction, and enough signs to follow. Silas Crowder. But his hand stayed on the reins. He let go after a second and started walking instead. The next morning came early. Cold air before sunrise, the kind that made breath visible and boots sound louder on packed dirt. Garrett was already at the stockyards when the first wagons rolled in. Cattle shifted in tight pens. Men moved along the rails, checking ropes, counting heads. A foreman shouted numbers while marking a ledger with a stub of pencil. Garrett leaned against a post, hat low, watching. Not the cattle, the people. He asked a question here, another there. Nothing direct. Just enough to pull a thread and see where it led. "Crowder's been moving stock at odd hours," one man said, scratching his jaw. "Not his usual routes." Garrett nodded. "Pays cash," another added. "Too clean for a man who runs short on water." Garrett nodded again. He didn't write anything down. He didn't need to. He was turning away when he heard a familiar voice. "Morning." He looked up. Lydia stood near the far fence, Eliza wrapped against her chest in a sling. The child's eyes were open now, wide and still, taking in the movement of the yard. Lydia held a strip of leather in her hand. Clean stitching, tight work. She was speaking to one of the men by the gate. "I can repair that in half a day," she said. "Stronger than it is now." The man shook his head before she finished. "Got no need," he said, though his saddle strap looked like it might give out before noon. "Thank you anyway," Lydia replied. She moved on. Next man, same offer, same result. Garrett watched her work her way down the line, each time the same tone, the same steady patience. No pleading, no irritation. Just asking, then moving on. Eliza shifted once, pressing her cheek against Lydia's shoulder. Lydia adjusted the sling without breaking stride. Garrett pushed off the post. "Morning," he said when he reached her. She looked at him, not surprised. "Morning," she answered. He glanced at the leather in her hand. "That's good work?" "It feeds us," she said. He nodded toward the far end of the yard. "Trail boss came in yesterday, rocking S outfit, rode hard. Their tacks worn thin." Lydia followed his gaze. "You know him?" "I know his kind." She studied him a second, not questioning, measuring. "Why tell me?" she asked. Garrett looked past her, toward the pens, toward the men who had already said no, then back at her. "You asked me to hold your child," he said. "Figured I could answer that." Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. She shifted Eliza higher and started walking in the direction he pointed. Garrett didn't follow right away. He stood there, watching her go, watching the way she stepped over uneven ground without looking down, watching the way the child stayed quiet against her. Then he turned back toward the pens. Silas Crowder was still out there, but for the first time since he'd picked up the trail, Garrett found himself taking his time. The rocking S outfit had set up along the far side of the yard, their horses tied nose to tail, saddles laid out on a rough plank table. Leather cracked at the bends, straps worn thin where weight had settled for too many miles. Lydia stood among them, sleeves rolled, hands moving with quiet certainty. She didn't speak much, just worked. A needle pulled through thick hide, thread drawn tight with a small, practiced tug. One of the cowhands leaned close, watching. "That'll hold?" he asked. She didn't look up. Longer than the rest of it. He gave a short nod and stepped back. Garrett stayed a few yards off, arms loose at his sides. He watched her finish a seam, test it once, then hand the piece back without ceremony. The trail boss, an older man with sun-browned skin and a slow voice, counted coins into her palm. Fair count. No argument. Lydia folded the money into a small cloth pouch and tucked it into her bag. She didn't smile, but something in her shoulders eased. Garrett turned away before she noticed him looking. By midday, the yard was louder, wagons in and out, hooves on packed dirt. A boy ran past with a bucket, sloshing water onto his boots. Garrett found the foreman again, asked another question, followed another thread. "Crowder's been buying feed out east," the man said. "Not from around here." Garrett tipped his head. "Cash?" "Always." Garrett let that sit. He thanked the man and moved on. When he stepped out onto the main road, the sun was high and flat, bleaching the color out of everything. The wind had picked up again, tugging at coat hems and loose boards. He crossed toward the general store. Two men stood near the hitching rail. They stopped talking when he passed. One of them spat into the dirt. "Thought you'd be gone by now," he said, not quite loud enough to be called out. Garrett didn't slow. Inside the store, it was cooler. Shelves lined with dry goods, flour sacks, tins of coffee, bolts of cloth stacked in careful rows. The smell of soap and burlap hung in the air. The shopkeeper, Mr. Hanley, looked up from his ledger. "You buying something?" he asked. Garrett shook his head. "Looking." Hanley's eyes flicked toward the door, then back to Garrett. "Heard you've been asking about Crowder." Garrett said nothing. Hanley leaned his elbows on the counter. "Folks around here mind their own lines. Water, land, gets complicated." Garrett met his gaze. "Looks that way." Hanley tapped the ledger once, closed it. "Complicated don't always mean wrong." Garrett nodded, slow. "Sometimes it does." Neither of them spoke after that. Garrett stepped back out into the light. Across the street, Lydia walked out of the livery with a bundle of worn straps over her arm. Eliza rested against her shoulder, asleep now, her small hand curled into the fabric of Lydia's dress. A man followed Lydia out, thin, nervous, hat pulled low. "You finish those by tomorrow," he said, pointing at the leather. "Or I find someone else." "I'll have them ready," Lydia replied. He hesitated, looked past her, at Garrett. Then he turned and went back inside. Lydia didn't look at Garrett right away. She shifted the bundle higher, adjusted Eliza with one hand, then started down the boardwalk. Garrett stepped into her path, not blocking, just there. "You'll need more thread," he said. She glanced up. "I'll manage." He nodded toward the store. "Hanley's got a stronger spool, holds better in dry air." Lydia considered that, then gave a small nod. "Thank you." She stepped past him. For a moment, Garrett thought that was all. Then she stopped. "People talk," she said, still facing forward. "They always do. They say you're here for Crowder." Garrett didn't answer. "They also say you don't stay anywhere long," she added. A wagon rattled by, wheels hitting a rut hard enough to make the boards underfoot tremble. Garrett shifted his weight. "That's been true." She turned then, looked at him fully. "Then don't stay on my account," she said. "I'm not a reason." Garrett held her gaze, didn't step closer. "I didn't say you were." She watched him a second longer, like she was weighing something she hadn't said yet. Then Eliza stirred, letting out a soft sound. Lydia's attention shifted at once. She adjusted the child, one hand smoothing the blanket. When she looked back, the moment had passed. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hale," she said, and continued down the boardwalk. Garrett stood where he was. The wind pulled at his coat again, carrying the smell of dust and distant rain. Across town, a door slammed. A horse snorted. Somewhere a hammer struck metal, steady and sure. Garrett turned toward the far end of the road. Crowder's trail hadn't gone cold, but it wasn't the only thing holding him in Stone Creek Basin anymore. By late afternoon, clouds gathered low over the ridge, heavy and slow. The kind that promised rain but made you wait for it. The air felt tight. Even the horses shifted more than usual. Garrett stood near the well at the edge of town, a folded paper in his hand. Not much to look at. Just numbers, dates, feed orders signed in different ink, but the same hand behind them. He had picked it up from a clerk who didn't know what he was handing over. It was enough. Across the street, Lydia's small workspace sat quiet. A single window, door half open. A strip of leather hung outside, weighted with a nail to keep it from curling in the wind. Garrett started toward it. He didn't make it halfway. A voice called out, loud enough this time. "Garrett Hale." He stopped. Silas Crowder stepped off the boardwalk near the saloon, boots hitting dirt with a steady sound. He was a broad man, thick through the chest, coat buttoned though the day had warmed. His hat sat low, but his eyes were clear. Behind him, two men leaned against the railing, not stepping forward, just watching. Garrett turned. The town slowed again. Not quiet, just waiting. "You've been asking questions," Crowder said. Garrett didn't move closer, didn't reach for anything. "Looks that way." Crowder smiled a little, not friendly. "You got a paper there says something about me?" Garrett lifted the folded sheet just enough to be seen, then lowered it again. "Some things don't read right," he said. Crowder took a step forward. "You aiming to fix that?" The wind picked up, carrying dust across the road. It caught at coats, tugged at hats. Garrett shifted his stance. Not wider, just steadier. "I'm aiming to set it straight." Crowder's hand hovered near his belt, not touching the gun, close enough to matter. A chair scraped on the saloon porch. Someone coughed. The piano inside had gone quiet. Garrett didn't look at the gun. He looked at Crowder. "Don't," he said. 2 words. Low, even. Crowder held his gaze. For a long second, nothing happened. Then a door opened behind Garrett. Sheriff Martin Cole stepped out, coat unbuttoned, badge dull in the fading light. He took in the scene in one sweep. "What's this?" Cole asked. No one answered right away. Garrett turned slightly, enough to include him. "Paperwork," he said. Crowder let out a breath through his nose. "You dragging the law into it now?" Cole stepped down from the porch. "If there's paper, I'll read it." Garrett handed it over. Cole unfolded it slow. His eyes moved across the page, then back again. "You got more than this?" he asked. Garrett nodded once. "Witnesses, 2 ranchers out east, and the feed clerk." Crowder shifted his weight. The men behind him straightened a little. Cole folded the paper back up, looked at Crowder. "You want to tell me about these accounts?" he asked. Crowder's jaw worked. He glanced at Garrett, then back at Cole. "Lot of paper gets written in this town," he said. Cole didn't blink. "And some of it gets answered." The wind dropped for a moment. The air stilled. Crowder looked around, at the men watching from doorways, at the faces along the boardwalk. He took his hand away from his belt. Slow. "All right," he said. "We can talk." Cole nodded toward the office. "Let's do that." Crowder turned. His men followed a step behind. As they passed Garrett, Crowder slowed just enough to speak without turning his head. "This ain't finished," he said. Garrett didn't answer. He watched them go. The town exhaled. A chair moved. Someone spoke again, quieter now. The piano picked up where it had left off, careful at first. Garrett stood in the road a moment longer. Then he turned toward the small workshop. Lydia stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame. Eliza rested against her shoulder, awake now, eyes fixed on the street. She hadn't stepped out, hadn't called to him. She had just watched. Garrett walked up to the steps, stopped a few feet away. "It's done," he said. Lydia studied his face. Not the words, the way he stood, the way his hands hung at his sides, empty. No gun, she said. No need. She nodded once. Eliza shifted, her small hand opening and closing against Lydia's shoulder. You could have ended it faster, Lydia said. Garrett looked past her into the room. A work table, tools laid out in neat lines, a spool of thread, dark and strong, just like he'd said. Faster ain't always better, he said. Lydia's eyes stayed on him a moment longer. Then she stepped aside, just enough to leave the doorway open. Garrett didn't move. Not yet. Inside, the room smelled of leather and oil, of work done by hand. Outside, the sky finally broke. A light rain started to fall, tapping soft against the wood, settling the dust. Garrett looked at the open door, then at Lydia, then at the child watching him like she had in the saloon. Something in his shoulders eased, just a fraction. I'll be around, he said. Lydia didn't answer right away. Then she shifted Eliza slightly, adjusting her grip the same way she had that first day. You don't have to be, she said. Garrett met her eyes. I know. The rain picked up, steady now. He stepped back from the doorway, letting the moment settle where it stood. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about where he needed to go next. He was thinking about whether he needed to leave at all. The rain carried on through the night. Not hard, just steady enough to soak into the ground and quiet the dust. By morning, Stone Creek Basin looked different. Cleaner, maybe. The edges softened. Garrett stood outside the small boarding house, saddle already set, his horse tied and waiting. A bedroll hung behind the cantle, everything packed the way it had been 100 times before. Ready to move. He checked the cinch strap once, then again. No reason to. It held just fine. Down the street, the town was waking slow. A woman swept her porch. Someone opened the bakery door, the smell of fresh bread drifting out into the cool air. A wagon rolled past, wheels leaving dark tracks in the damp dirt. Garrett rested his hand on the saddle horn. He didn't mount. Across the road, Lydia's workshop door stood open. Same as yesterday, same as the day before that. A strip of leather hung outside again, darker now from the rain. The nail holding it had been driven in straighter. He crossed the street. Inside, the room was warm from a small stove in the corner. A kettle sat on top, faint steam rising. Tools lay arranged across the table. Awl, needles, thread spools lined up by size. Lydia sat at the workbench, shoulders slightly forward, one hand guiding a stitch through thick leather. Eliza lay in a small wooden box lined with folded cloth beside the table, watching the ceiling like it held something worth studying. Garrett stopped just inside the doorway. You're up early, he said. Lydia didn't look up right away. She finished the stitch, pulled the thread tight, then set the piece down. Work doesn't wait, she said. Garrett nodded. He stepped farther in, boots quiet on the wooden floor. Eliza turned her head at the sound. Her eyes found him. She didn't smile. She just looked, the same way she always did. Garrett moved closer without thinking. He rested one hand on the edge of the box, not touching her, just there. She remembers, Lydia said. Garrett glanced at her. She doesn't remember much, he said. Lydia shook her head once. Some things don't need remembering. Garrett didn't answer. Outside, a hammer struck metal somewhere down the street. 2 short taps, then a pause. I heard, Lydia said, picking up another piece of leather. Crowder's being held in Cole's office, waiting on a judge from Cheyenne. That's right. You'll be leaving then. It wasn't a question. Garrett looked at the table, at the neat lines of tools, at the work already started for the day. My work's done, he said. Lydia's hands kept moving, Needle in, thread through, pull. That's usually when men like you go, she said. Garrett shifted his weight. His hand tightened slightly on the edge of the box, then eased. Usually, he said. Silence settled in for a moment. Not uncomfortable. Just there. Eliza made a small sound. Not a cry. Just something soft, like she was testing her voice. Garrett reached out this time. Slow. Careful. She caught his finger again. Same as before. Garrett let out a breath he hadn't noticed he'd been holding. Lydia watched him now. Not the child. Him. You've got your horse ready, she said. Garrett nodded. And you're still here. Another nod. She set the leather down. What are you waiting for? She asked. Garrett didn't answer right away. He looked down at the small hand holding his finger, then at Lydia. Something worth staying for, he said. The words sat between them. Lydia didn't move. Outside, the wind picked up again, lighter now, the kind that carried the smell of wet earth and wood smoke. You don't stay for people you barely know, she said. Garrett met her eyes. Maybe I do now. She held his gaze. Long enough that he thought she might turn away. She didn't. You don't know me, she said. I know enough, he answered. She shook her head, not in disagreement, just thinking. I've seen men come through towns like this, she said quietly. They help for a day, maybe two. Then they're gone. And everything they touched goes back to how it was. Garrett listened. I don't need that, she added. I don't build on that. He nodded once. I'm not passing through, he said. Lydia looked at him, really looked this time. Not measuring, not guarding, just looking. Then Eliza shifted again, tightening her grip. Lydia glanced down, then back up. You don't have to prove anything, she said. Garrett gave a small shake of his head. I'm not trying to. Another quiet moment passed. Then Garrett did something he hadn't done in a long time. He reached to his side, unfastened the worn leather strap that held his revolver. He set the gun belt down on the work table. Not loud, just enough to be heard. The room changed. Not much, but enough. Lydia's eyes dropped to the belt, then back to him. Garrett straightened. I spoke to Cole, he said. He needs a deputy who knows the land, knows how to track without chasing trouble into town. Lydia said nothing. I told him I'd consider it, Garrett went on. And? Garrett looked at her. I'd need a reason, he said. Lydia held his gaze, didn't rush to answer. Eliza's fingers loosened, then tightened again. Finally, Lydia stepped closer. Not all the way, just enough. She shifted Eliza in her arms, then held her out, the same way she had the first time. No explanation. Garrett took the child. This time his hands didn't hesitate. Eliza settled against his chest like she belonged there. Lydia watched him for a second, then nodded, once. That's as much answer as you're getting today, she said. Garrett almost smiled. Outside, the town moved on. Wagons, voices, the slow rhythm of a place learning how to stand steady. Inside the small workshop, Garrett Hale stood with a child in his arms and a gun left behind on the table. And for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about the road. He was thinking about the door he'd just stepped through and whether he'd close it behind him or keep it open. He didn't move. Not yet. The wind passed through Stone Creek Basin the same way it always had, over rooftops, through open doors, across the long stretch of road that led out of town. It carried dust and time. and the quiet weight of choices a man made when no one was watching. Garrett had ridden into plenty of places before, always with a name to find, a job to finish, and then a road waiting for him when it was done. But this time, there wasn't a road pulling at him. There was a small room, a workbench worn smooth by steady hands, a child who didn't let go once she decided to hold on, and a woman who never asked him to stay, only stood there long enough for him to decide it on his own. Some men spend their whole lives proving they're strong. Others learn, somewhere along the way, that strength isn't in how fast you draw, but in what you choose to protect when you don't. Garrett Hale had been feared across 3 territories, but in the end, it wasn't fear that gave his life shape. It was the moment he chose to stay. And maybe that's the part that lingers, because sooner or later, everyone stands in a doorway like that. 1 foot on the road, 1 foot inside something that could become a home. The question is, what do you do when nothing is forcing you to leave? Would you stay, even if no one asked you to? If this story stayed with you, there are more like it waiting. Quiet stories about the choices that shape a life and the people who make it worth living. You're always welcome back here.